And that's why one of our main focuses for today's show is going to be looking at the relationship between social media and military dictatorships. Now, social media has always had a kind of myth or an ethos of democracy. I mean, for most of the early decade or decade and a half of social media, the companies sort of touted themselves as forces of democracy. Democratic governments celebrated social media as platforms for democracy. And there was this general, turns out false, assumption that social media was inherently democratic and would be inherently a force for good. Now, we've since been dispelled of such notions, and democratic governments or aspiring democratic governments are starting to reassess the power that social media companies have and the role that social media platforms play when it comes to politics and society as a whole. And perhaps one of the more compelling but also stark examples of this, of course, is in the country of Myanmar. Now, Myanmar recently was in the news for what was framed as a coup d'etat by the military. And this is partially true. The partial part is that the military never actually gave up control. So it wasn't so much as a coup d'etat as the military reasserting command and reasserting authority and arresting and imprisoning any civilian politicians, any artists, intellectuals, or educators who could be perceived as being opponents or enemies to the regime. Now, interestingly enough, anytime a military seizes power or consolidates power, inevitably the internet plays a role, and that was certainly the case here in Myanmar. So this story from the New York Times details some of the measures that the military regime, the military junta, is using in Myanmar to basically control the internet. Because, I started by suggesting that social media is not the inherent force for democracy that we thought it was. But it's also not necessarily a tool for military dictatorships either. I mean, I think the primary argument that we like to make here at MetaViews is that the internet serves the internet. That digital platforms are in the agenda of serving themselves as proto-countries, as proto-empires, and that democracy or military organizations, they're secondary to the ambitions of these platforms. So while democratic governments are trying to wrestle their heads around how to tame or regulate or at least mitigate against the threats of social media platforms, well, military organizations have an entirely different ballgame. Because what is encouraging in Myanmar are the protests, is the civil society, are citizens, individuals in Myanmar, mostly young people, quite frankly, who are risking their lives to demand human rights, to demand democracy, to demand individual expression. And that's why social media can be such a threat to really any government, but in particular a military-led government. So this article basically details the types of measures that the military has taken, both during the seize of power and since then. And it really speaks to how difficult it is to control the internet, how difficult it is to control people's access to the internet. In this case, it did talk about how the military prioritized shutting off the internet, how they sent military personnel to the telecom offices, to the internet companies, basically to the backbone of the Myanmar internet, which, due to the nature in which Myanmar has been historically a military dictatorship, their internet backbone is really not that extensive, not that difficult to control. Of course, like many countries around the world, their wireless infrastructure is far more advanced than their fiber or old school copper landline infrastructure. And interestingly enough, they talk about here in this article how most of the Myanmar internet was built by Huawei, was built by Chinese wireless telecom manufacturers who, of course, build in the type of surveillance and controls that are conducive to a military dictatorship. Now, what's kind of comical about the analysis in this article is it talks a little bit about the kind of Keystone Cops that, the military dictatorship does not have, for example, a specially trained unit who understand telecommunications, both to disrupt, sabotage, disrupt, or control it. Instead, they just sent rank and file soldiers who unplugged things that did need to be unplugged, and may have even destroyed equipment that the military would not have wanted destroyed. But it was a kind of a heavy-handed or blunt instrument way of really trying to shut off the country as a whole. So it speaks to me a kind of paradox that on the one hand, the military recognizes the threat that the internet offers to their power, to their control, but they don't recognize that it could be an asset. Now, similarly, the protesters, and I wanted to rest on this photo for a moment, the protesters also recognize the value of communication, the need for them to kind of reach beyond Myanmar's borders and get international solidarity and international attention. But again, the fact that unlike, say, protesters in Hong Kong, that they did not anticipate the need for decentralized infrastructure, or alternatively did not have the existing literacy or knowledge of decentralized infrastructure that might have allowed them to circumvent the military's attempt to shut things down. Because this is not the first time in which we've either seen a military coup or even just in South Asia, an attempt by an authoritarian government to control its internet. So civil society organizations, not just in Myanmar, but around the world, need to start readying themselves for these types of episodes. They need to start building in the capacity for decentralized communications and or extra national communications, i.e. finding ways in which they can circumvent attempts to shut off an entire country's internet, which is what Myanmar initially attempted. Because as we've seen, whether in the Middle East, whether in South Asia, in Africa, all across the world, South America as well, a military's attempt to shut off the internet is never total. It's never 100%, right? And here's the paradox. On the one hand, the military recognizes that the internet's a threat. But on the other hand, the military depends upon the internet for their own command and control. Any military organization in our contemporary moment in history must use internet technologies for responsiveness, for surveillance, for command and control. To not do so means basically your opponent is going to use the internet against you. So just as, you have to bring a gun to a gunfight rather than a knife, or you have to bring the necessary armaments to the conflict so that you can survive, if not be victorious, the internet is indispensable for any organization that wishes to hold power, maintain power, let alone do so at the scale that, in this case, the Myanmar military wants to do across the country. And so that means that if the military, on the one hand, wants to deny other people the internet while affording it to themselves, that in and of itself is a strategic opportunity. And civil society organizations, forces of democracy, need to recognize that decentralized technology is necessary in these instances. Now, I'm going to assume that there are forces on the ground in Myanmar, whether independent or aligned with foreign actors, who are currently trying to find ways to use decentralized technology to counter the military's power and to empower civil society and people who are in favor of democracy. I have not yet, unfortunately, seen instances of that, but I'm not in a position to dig that deeply. I'm curious if any of you guys have found that or will find that moving forward, because I think this is a really important issue moving forward as this military coup continues to unfold. Now, I stumble when I use the words military coup because the reality in Myanmar is the military never gave up power. I mean, they sort of had a power sharing agreement in which they shared power with a civilian government, but the military never itself subjected itself to that government. They always maintained control over both the military, but also a substantive part of the economy as a whole. I raise this only because the issue of social media and military dictatorships is not just about the military fearing social media or wanting to control social media. It's also been about the military using social media. And that's where it's worth remembering in recent history, there was really disturbing violence and genocide in Myanmar committed and enabled by the military. It was also committed and enabled by civilians. Often the nature of ethnic violence is, a military or politicians use the media to foment hatred and to get everybody worked up. And that's very much what happened in this case in terms of the Rohingya minority, an ethnic minority that exists in rural Myanmar that were subject to really horrific violence. And researchers have concluded that the organizing, the mobilizing, the amplification of this violence happened on Facebook, right? The military, politicians, bigots used Facebook as a bully pulpit to get people worked up and focused on committing atrocious acts against the Rohingya peoples. And, this isn't just an instance of researchers saying this happened. This is an example where Facebook itself admitted that they were responsible, that their platform was used to facilitate this violence. Now, Facebook, they were not malicious in the sense of they tried to make this happen. Rather, this was a story of neglect, right? This was a story of irresponsibility that Facebook expanded into Myanmar before hiring people who spoke the local languages, before hiring staff and moderators who could then understand what content was happening on Facebook. So as a result, it was kind of as if there were no adults present, as if there was no one responsible on Facebook in Myanmar. And it's what then allowed for this genocide, for this really tragic violence and atrocities to take place. And I bring it up in terms of Myanmar. I still have our farm audio turned on. I bring this up in terms of Myanmar's attempt to control the internet because it's never just about military organizations. It's about the internet providers themselves. Internet providers, whether Facebook, whether telecom providers, they could go a long way to making their services resistant against dictatorships, resistant against control, because that was the original design of the internet, right? As a decentralized platform, as a decentralized medium, that would make it really difficult for any external organization, any hostile organization to compromise it or to use it against us. Now, one could rightly argue that potential was never achieved, that it was always an aspirational value, and that the internet always has its problems, its faults. But I don't think we should give up on that dream. And I think the more that militaries, that governments, that corporations threaten to control the internet, the more it behooves us to think about how to configure the technology, to think about how to spread literacy so that people are in a position to resist that. So it's not up to a military, it's not up to a government, it's not up to anybody to decide whether they can turn the internet off, because the secret is they can't. They can't turn the internet off because they depend upon it, because they need the internet for their own operations, for their own strategic objectives. And we can subvert that. If there's a decentralized internet for one, there's a decentralized internet for all. And that's why we essentially need to promote and champion these types of stories. As tragic as it is that Myanmar has once again fallen into the grips of a military dictatorship, these are opportunities for decentralized technology. These are opportunities for a decentralized internet that resists those attempts. So I offer this as our headline for today, as a story that we're going to watch, because I want us all to pay attention as to whether some of the protesters, whether the small d Democrats on the ground in Myanmar are going to be in a position to use decentralized technology, or whether they'll find allies outside of Myanmar who will help them do so. As cyberpunks, it is our moral imperative to encourage and promote such activity.